Hello, so here is our third video unit, and this one is about the Middle Colonies. So it's basically about where we live, right smack between the two colonies that we learned about. So if you see here, the Middle Colonies are basically Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, I guess Maryland, as well. And we learned that the first two were settled by the English. Well, these ones are settled by the Dutch. So in 1621, the Dutch granted the Dutch East India Company to colonize New Netherland, mostly to expand their fur trade, and their capital was New Amsterdam in 1625. Today, you know New Amsterdam as New York. So this was first discovered or explored, I should say, by Europeans by Henry Hudson, who was an Englishman, but he sailed for the Dutch East India Company. And he wrote that when he saw this area, that it was the finest for cultivation that I ever in my life set foot upon it. And it also abounds in trees of every description. The natives are very good for people. And he wrote a lot more about it. You can find his journals online. Lots of Dutch poets wrote glorious things about this land. The poet Jacob Steendam wrote that New Netherlands is the epitome and the noblest of all countries, a blessed province where milk and honey flow. So they were big fans. And unlike the other two areas that we learned about that were basically just English, there was a lot more diversity in this area. It mentions Dutch, Germans, French, Scandinavians, also Croatians, Italians, some Irish. Plus, religious-wise, you have Jews, Lutherans, Quakers, Mennonites, Catholics, people of religious and national backgrounds that you wouldn't see in the other two areas. Also, by the 1660s, 1/5 of the New Netherlands was of African ancestry, both free and enslaved. Eventually, the southern settlements replace that as the highest ratio. But in the beginning, it's more so in this area. And not because there were so many slaves. There were slaves in the Middle Colonies, but there were a lot of freed Africans as well. Some of them came free, and some of them were slaves brought here and actually got their freedom. These colonies also had better relationships with natives than the other settlements. Not to say that there were no wars between the settlers and the natives, because there were, but much less than with either the New England or the Virginia settlements. Now, eventually, the English took over this area. They saw it as a wedge between their settlements to the north and south and wanted that to stop. So the Duke of York was given permission to drive the Dutch out in 1664. And you see an image here of the Dutch governor Peter Stuyvesant. He surrendered. He called the Dutch in the area a call to arms, but they really didn't respond. So he was the governor, and it then became the New York, and New Jersey was divided off of that area. You still see lots of things, schools and buildings named after Peter Stuyvesant in New York today. He was the governor there from 1647 to 1664. He expanded New Amsterdam beyond just the southern tip of Manhattan, where it originally began. He was responsible for things like building the protective wall on Wall Street, for building canals that are now Broad Street and Broadway. He was a member of the Dutch Reformed Church, and even though there were more religions in the Middle Colonies than anywhere else, he wasn't a big fan of that. Who was more of a fan of religious toleration, however, was William Penn. And William Penn was a big advocate for democracy and religious freedom. And he is well known today for helping plan and develop Philadelphia. You may see the statue of him on top of City Hall there in Philly. He saw this area as a holy experiment for Quakers. He granted every adult male 50 acres. They also had the right to vote. This is important. They had a representative assembly. That's important. That's something we've been talking about, participatory government, right? And also religious freedom. And for these and other reasons, this was known as the city of brotherly love. If you want to say sisterly love as well, Quakers also believed in spiritual equality for men and women. And you would see women preaching the gospel in a Quaker church, which at this time was like unfathomable. And eventually, when Quakers become the minority in Pennsylvania, some get a little bit bothered by that. If you could go to Philadelphia, you can also visit the Quaker Church. It's not too far from, let's see, the cemetery where Ben Franklin is buried. So I highly recommend a trip there if you haven't gone yet. All right. Um, Native American relations. Penn regulated trade with the natives. He provided a court consisting of both colonists and natives. So the natives got along for the most part with William Penn, and they had no major conflict for over 50 years. It was mostly different tribes of the Lenni Lenape that he dealt with. Penn had no military ambitions. He refused to fortify Philadelphia, and that really helped with their relations. He did form lots of treaties with the natives, and he bought land from Delaware chiefs. He was still a businessman. He wasn't just a big religious democracy guy. He knew what he had to do with business as well. Besides dealings with the natives, this area attracted many more immigrants, especially Germans. And eventually, Philadelphia basically becomes a German speaking city. And that's when Quakers became the minority. That's also when slavery was introduced. Quakers were like amongst the first abolitionists, and they weren't too happy about that. Uh, Philadelphia eventually becomes a big haven for freed slaves, but that's not to say that there were never slaves in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania. These basic values of William Penn, we've been talking about different themes about participatory government and rights, but it's William Penn's values that takes these plus others and really makes it important values to the new nation. And you see why Philadelphia is such a central part to the beginning of our nation, and where, not just obviously because of where its location is, being in the middle was important, but it's symbolically a very important place as well. Go Philadelphia, just not their sports teams. All right. A little bit more, the 13 colonies, more colonies become a thing between the 1600s and the 1700s. I have some examples here. By 1632, a charter for land north of the Chesapeake Bay was given to Lord Baltimore. His name was Cecil Calvert. He had a very long title, which I won't recite for you guys. He was a notorious Catholic, even when England was very Protestant. So he was a big believer in religious toleration. He managed Maryland from his home in England and governed Maryland for about 42 years. But because of his efforts, Maryland became famous for religious freedom. So once again, think of how important that is to our, burgeoning country. 1663, the land that's between Virginia, right, that whole settlement, and Spanish Florida, because right, Spain still controlled that area, that became what's now North and South Carolina. In 1732, there was a charter to be a haven for those imprisoned for debt. That's sort of pretty cool, right? And that became what's now Georgia. So you have all 13 colonies by 1752. And now we're getting to the fun stuff where we start to learn about those colonies and eventually why they revolt against England. All right, if you have any questions on this, please make sure to ask me next class. And I'll see you then.